I'm sorry, I didn't realize that I was such an incredible person. Thank you very much. Well, before I start my lecture, let me just tell you a little bit about me and my love for Sanibel. We came down, my husband and I, on vacation in 1977, and those no-see-ums did a job. We ended up buying property. And then in 1980, we came here, bought a house. Our children were 12 and 9. And I decided that it was, my husband and I, it was a good place for us to extend our children's childhood because we came from New York. And that's enough said about that. I actually worked as a social worker for the city. I was, for the state, I was a adoptions counselor. And I always wrote. I wrote up in New York, I wrote here. I got involved with the Historical Village in 1999, and that's when we did everything. There were maybe 10 or 12 volunteers, and we collected the money, we washed the curtains, we did everything. And a friend of mine, Monford Strobel, said to me, you know, when people come in the door, you know more about the history because you've been here for so long. And I had the privilege of knowing a lot of the women that I talked about. Some of them are still alive, but the majority of them are not. And they told me stories that were not in any books or anything. So my recollection of a lot of that is in the book. And I'm going to say a couple of things about these women. They all had something in common. They were tough cookies. They might not have looked like that, but they were. They were determined, and they loved the island as much as I do, and they fought on a number of ways to preserve it. And they were in with the Lee County Commissioners. They started, you know, bike rodeos, the bike paths. So they are such an integral part of the island that I felt the second book I had to write about them. So I'm going to start off with Dr. Louise Perry. She is involved with Dean Darling. She and her husband came here in 1918 and didn't like what they saw. They said, well, there are no conveniences here. So they decided to leave. The problem was there was no ferry. So they had to stay. I guess they weathered it because a couple of years later they came back and built a house on Casa Ebel Road. And she was a paleontologist involved in shells. She started her own lab in her house. She was very, very involved with the island. During World War II, she started an eye clinic for children. She also was involved with Dean Darling. She donated property on the island, which helped with the refuge. She died at 88 in 1962, I believe. She donated her shell collection back to the island. Again, she was one of those people that people would say during the war, if anybody needed anything, Louise Perry could be counted on to help out. And that's kind of the theme that I have with the women that I'm talking about, that they were part of the island, they wanted to help out, and Louise was certainly one of the foremost ones that did that. Again, going back to these women who were so involved with the island, they adjusted and they became part of the island. After World War II, after the Civil War, there was a depression, and people came to the island, and if they would farm the land for 5 years, they would get 160 acres. And it was a good way. A lot of them had lost everything. And I'm talking about a lot of the gone dogs. And one of the things that used to amuse me is that these women would come down and they would dress like the early 1920s, and they would walk up and down in front of Cassidy Bell and on Sundays and parade. I mean, these were not women who were not educated, you know, they came from some podunk town. They were well-educated people, and they were tough. And one of the more amusing ones that came down was a concert pianist named Julia Dickey, and this is her picture. Julia studied under a student of Franz Liszt. She traveled all over Europe performing, and she and her husband came down here in 1906. He was a fisherman, and she was, and they were well-to-do, and she was a shell person. She loved shells. They came to Sanibel, and they found out we didn't have periwinkle way at Domax. So it took a little while for them to travel from San Carlos Bay to the beach. And they weren't fond of that. So somebody said to them, if you go up to Captiva, it's narrower. You'll have an easier time of it. So John went up. John was a pharmacist. John went up to Captiva, and the only person living on Captiva at the time was William Binder. And if you read my first book, it'll tell you about Binder. But Binder pretty much owned most of the Gold Coast, which would be from Tween Waters all the way around to where the Green Flash is now in that area. So John liked what he saw. It was narrow. He could get from the bay to the Gulf. And on a handshake, he bought property from Binder. Julia and he came back the next year. They built a house. They came back with their 3 sons and their teacher. And the sons built the teacher a house, which is still probably part of Tween Waters, maybe the dining room. That tells you kind of where they lived. Julia's problem was she was a concert pianist, and she didn't have a lot in common with the women on Sanibel. So she said to her friends, if you come down, I'll give you a piece of land, and you'll build a house. And that's kind of how Captiva turned into a tourist area, and Sanibel was more of a farming area, though they did both. Julia got tired of fish and everything, so she decided to raise chickens. The problem with chickens is that those rascally raccoons show up. And Julia had had enough of the raccoon. She finally went and got John's gun and shot him. Not only did she shoot him, she cooked him. And they had him for dinner that Sunday. Sons were thrilled they didn't have chicken. Apparently raccoons were pretty good. Julia also started the first Sunday school in her house. But she made the front page of the newspaper, the news press at the time. Why? Because she took off her stockings when she went to the beach. People were very upset about that. We're going to wander down Tween Waters now. This is Dottie Wakefield, Dottie Price. Her parents, Grace and Bowen, owned Tween Waters. At that time it was called Mrs. Price's Inn. And Ding Darling was a fan. He and Penny stayed there. And Ding said to Grace one time, why don't you just call it Tween Waters? Because Tween Waters makes sense to me. Dottie was born in 1924. She lived on Captiva. She went to school at Sanibel one-room schoolhouse with her friend, Marie Dickey. She tells about how she could walk from Tween Waters all the way down to Redfish Pass. If anybody knows, there was a hurricane and there was Redfish Pass in the water. She also used to love to go out in her boat and fish, and she considered, now I knew Dottie, Dottie was a very classy lady, as you can tell. She died in the early 2000s. She was very involved in the island herself. During World War II, she was in boarding school. Her father died, so she came back to help her mother run Twin Waters. At that time, the Air Force was using Bowman's Beach as an air-to-ground target range. That must have been interesting. You know, stories, I've heard stories of them missing a lot. There's a Casa Ebel story about a manager who was out on his boat that nearly got knocked off. Anyway, there was a lot of Air Force men living out in Captiva, and she met her husband, Johnny. It was love at first sight for them. They got married in 1943, and people came to their wedding on Air Force crash boats. After the war was over, she and Johnny came back. They were involved in a number of businesses. She was very, very involved in the local charities. And I can remember seeing her at the community house, very well dressed, very well educated. She got involved with a lot of the children and talking about her ideal childhood on Sanibel. And of course, what we all say, those of us who have been here for a long time, it's not what it used to be. Completely the opposite of Julia Dickey and Dottie is Dessa Rossi. Dessa Rossi and Andy were definitely the characters on Captiva. You can't see it. Okay? You can see. Dessa was 14 when she met Andy. She married him a year later. Andy Rossi was a fisherman's fisherman. He came from England when he was a year old to New York, and then he came down to Sanibel and Captiva. He loved to fish. He lived in a fishing boat. He was a gypsy. Everybody knew him. He was everybody's favorite guide. And when he was up in Punta Gorda swimming, he met Dessa. They married in 1924. And then the two of them became gypsies, fishing. They would make 12 cents a pound for trout, and they caught 400 to 500 a day. Anybody who's down here fishing would be very jealous. But Dessa hated it. She wanted to live in a house. Finally she got pregnant, and she decided she wanted to have a house. Andy knew one of the people on Captiva who said, okay, Andy, you can have this piece of property if you build a house. So he went out and he gathered palmetto cabbage palm fronds and any kind of driftwood he could find, and he built a house. And it had a shell, they called it the shack. It had a shell floor. And Dessa used to cook outside on a kerosene lamp, on a kerosene stove, and pump water next to the privy. So they lived pretty basically, but they loved it. They loved Captiva, they loved the water, they loved the fish, and everybody loved them. In 1935, Andy got a job at Twin Waters because of Ding for $15 a day, and he got lunch. And Dessa would go to pick him up, and sometimes he would save half of his sandwich so the kids would have something to eat at night. That's how they lived. In 1940, Pop Randall, who owned the McCarthy's Marina today, he died, and his children said to Andy, if you want to buy the dock, we'll sell it to you. for $800. Jay Darling lent him the $800, and he bought the lot. Immediately he put on a restaurant and a bar, and Dessa was there. She cooked. She apparently was a good cook, but if you walked in there and you said you wanted a hamburger, she said, not cooking hamburgers today. What else do you want? The fishermen loved it because they could drop off their catch and get a cold beer. And it was an up-and-coming place. People had fun there. Andy had a guitar. She had a ukulele. People like Lindbergh's, Adlai Stevenson. It was a happening place. Everybody went to Andy's bar. And I consider Dessa and Andy to be like the Ralph and Alice Crampton of their day. They were always fighting about something, but they loved each other dearly. And Dessa would get to a point she was so frustrated about what was going on in the bar. You know, a couple of drunk fishermen, they could get into it. That she'd go and she'd throw the cash register in the water. And that would get their attention, they'd stop fighting. Or she'd be mad at Andy about something and she'd throw something else in the water. When Paul McCarthy bought a marina from Andy's family, he said, you never knew what you were going to find in the water. Dessa's way of dressing was the halter top and the bloomers that you see. That's what she wore. The Board of Health would come into the restaurant and have a fit. Why she dressed like that? She's serving food. Finally, she had enough. She threw the Board of Health guy out the door, and she could, and never went back in again. She died in 1966, and Andy never remarried. He died in 1983. When people asked him why he hadn't remarried, he said, Dessa was one of a kind.
Probably.
Lilias Cockerell was an English stage actress. She came to the island, she came from England with her husband, who was a playwright. He spoke 5 languages. She always called him the captain. I'm not sure what he captained. But they came in 1926, and they drove down from Canada to Florida. When they got here, she ran a boarding house. When they got here, the community house had just been built. They put on plays. She was always singing. She was one of those people that you know who's always happy and everything. They wrote plays. They raised money for all types of things. She was in a Shakespearean play with Frank Bailey. She was in all kinds of musicals with Ernest Bailey. And she became a noted gynecologist, which is one of the shows she's pictured with. She was so well known that she got a letter from somebody from the Far East who wrote to Lilias Cockerell, Sanibel Island, wherever that is. And it reached her. Her husband died in 1948 and spread his ashes out in San Carlos Bay. And at the time, she said to Leon Crumpler, who was the ferry boat captain, and the Kinsey brothers, that I want my ashes spread on San Carlos Bay too. When she died in 1956, that's exactly what they did. They took one of the ferries, they went out in San Carlos Bay, but the wind was such that if they had to turn the boat around so the ashes wouldn't come back on them. And as they left, there were 4 dolphins, as many of you, if you've ridden, have seen, they followed the boat. Leon turned the boat around to go back into San Carlos Bay, and now the dolphins were in front. They were like leading the boat. And they put her ashes like her husband had wanted. And people said that if it hadn't been for Lilias, it would not have been such a happy, wonderful place again. She fell in love with the island, and she fell in love with the shells. And the community house, they raised money for electricity, everything. And that was, again, an important part of the island at that time. Can't talk about the island without Priscilla Murphy. I have my director here, thank you. You're in charge. I always need help. We can't talk about the island unless we talk about Priscilla Murphy. Priscilla and Pat Murphy had been reading an article about where are the best places in Florida to get shells. And they said Sanibel Island. So in 1944, now there had been a hurricane in 1944. So I can't imagine what Sanibel was like when she arrived, but they loved it. They moved here. And her house is on Periwinkle. It's now J.R. Woods Real Estate Company. She and Pat came here, again, fell in love with the island. She became familiar with the island. And that's when all the folks from up north, when I came down here in 1980, they went, "You're from up north." Well, all the folks from up north started coming into the area and buying property, and they were developing it. So in 1955, she set up the Priscilla Murphy Real Estate Company, and she was it. She was Priscilla Murphy Real Estate Company. We didn't have maps. Periwinkle Way was an old washboard road, so she had a Jeep. And that's how she got around the island. She went down to Fort Myers, to the courthouse, got maps, made maps herself of the island, which she would use there. Hold on a minute. Hello? She would pass out these maps, and she had one occasion where, and again, look at the island then. It was her house, and then maybe another house down by the lighthouse. People got off the mailboat, and they would walk up, go into her office. One couple from New York came into her office, and they said, "Can you call me a taxi?" She said, "No, but I can lend you my car." So she gave them her Jeep. And of course they were flawed. People from New York, somebody's giving me a car. They drove all over New York. They drove all over Sanibel and checked it out, and probably came back and bought property. But what Priscilla would do is she had a client, she'd go down to the dock, meet the mailboat, and then she'd go over to the Coke machine. You know, the old Coke machines with a bottle cap? And she'd gather all the bottle caps, and she'd take them out, and she'd push the bottle cap down into the sand and say, "That's your lawn. That's where your property is." And they trusted her for it. She's the one that talked Merida into buying South Seas Plantation from the Carters. So she was very, very influential on the island. She was involved in the building of the parish of St. Isabel's. In 1969, she finally had enough sales that she hired somebody. And after 1 year, that salesman had $1 million in sales. So she was it. If you wanted to buy property, you went to Priscilla. Her biggest sale was in 1970, and guess where? 200 acres, an old key lime plantation, now known as Sanctuary. She divorced Pat and married Leo Shelsky. Priscilla loves to dance, and she met Leo at a dance at St. Isabel's. And she was so, he was so much in love with her, he asked her to marry him 5 or 6 times. She finally said in 1976 yes. And she put a special floor in her house so they could dance. She retired in 1972, and again, she was one of those, she was this little prim lady, and when she was involved with anything up at St. Isabel's, she'd say, "You do this." I said, "Okay, no problem." And she was always happy to tell us, "You're young. The first thing you should do is buy property on Sanibel, because it's going to be very expensive soon." That was her deal. Last but not least, a dear friend, Mariel Goss, who passed away a year or so ago. Mariel was one of those wonderful ladies who spoke softly and carried a big stick. In 1972, when she was in her 40s, she came to a horrifying conclusion. Because of all the construction that was going on up and down Periwinkle, it was unsafe for anybody to bike, anybody to walk. The only bike path that they had on the island was in front of the community house, and that was unacceptable. So first thing she did with her friend Jeri Magg and Grace Whitehead was go to the sheriff and said, "How about enforcing the speed limit?" Nah, we're doing it. So she went to the county and talked about the county commissioner. You know, how about if we have bike paths on Sanibel? Yeah, not doing that. So she had read an article about a woman in Washington, D.C. who had gone up against every political nonsense she could think of and got a bike path built from Washington, D.C. to Mount Vernon. So whatever she did, Mariel decided to copy. She organized a 501c3 and raised money selling buttons and t-shirts just to be able to put forward some kind of proposal or go to somebody who could put in a bike path. She called Tallahassee and she learned the correct width and amount of asphalt for a trail, but there was no state funding. Nobody has any money. I always wonder where all that money goes. So they formed the Sanibel Bike Path Committee. They called it Hike and Bike. Their slogan was preserve, protect, and pedal. And this is really important for those of you who see, you know, all the people riding on the bike path. This was a turning moment for the island to have these bike paths. She tells, and this is a funny story, you have to realize this was 1973, and the majority of the people living in the area were from the south, particularly the men. So for 3 women who were from Northeast to come to them, the Lee County Commissioners, and say, "We would like bike paths," their comment was, "Go home, ladies, and cook and go back to your elitist island." So what did they do? They decided to get the attention of the media. And they had a bike in. And what they did is they rode their bikes with children and everybody down Periwinkle so slowly, they stopped traffic and the media paid attention. Then all of a sudden, the commissioners appointed somebody to come in, and they even striped, they laid out the path and everything. But of course, the biggie, they had no money. So they decided to raise the money themselves. And they did. They put an ad in the paper. You buy a piece of the bike path for $200. Anyway, they raised enough money in excuse me, folks. 1974, they got approval for the bike path. In 1976, the completion of an 8-foot wide path from Causeway Road to Tarpon Road. And that was a big deal. Mario also continued to be involved with school issues. We went through a point where Sanibel, we had K through 5, and we constantly put in extra little buildings. They didn't want to build a school, and we ended up suing Lee County to build a school K through 8. And their whole deal was, you people have so much money, why don't you build your own school? So she was constantly involved in the community, as were all the rest of the women. And I think that's it. I've collected all mine. If anybody has any questions. Okie dokie.